Hello, everyone. Welcome to Developing Student Metacognition via Online Discussions. And so I'm presenting to you from Genesee Community College in Batavia, where it's a rainy 37 degrees and kind of miserable out. But at least we don't have to shovel it, right? So my name's Judith Littlejohn. Here at GCC, I'm an instructional designer. I'm also an adjunct who teaches history. Most of the classes I teach are online. Occasionally I do teach in the classroom, but it's pretty rare. Because I'm a full-time staff member, I can't teach during my working hours. So I either have to pick up a night class or teach online. And generally, I choose to teach online. And I've been working in online learning for 12 years. I started out on the student side and then worked through developing our virtual campus, and then went back to school and became an instructional designer. So for the past 2 years, I've been working as an instructional designer. And with that, when I first started as an instructional designer, I was teaching online. Our semester was just starting out, and we had a workshop here on campus, similar to the workshops you guys do. The week before classes start, we call them PAD activities. It's professional activity days. And we had a full day workshop with Rush Cosgrove from the Foundation for Critical Thinking. And we talked about, focused a lot on the elements of thought and how we can help students understand when they're looking at sources, reading materials, watching the news or whatever, the purpose, question, information, etc., and how we can incorporate that into our classes. And I was quite taken with that, and I'll show you in a minute. And then last year, during that same workshop week, actually, it was scheduled for that week, and we ended up with a snow day, the day he was supposed to come out, and he came back a couple weeks later. We had a workshop with Dr. John Drager from Buffalo State, and he has a great blog here, Improve with Metacognition. And he talked a lot about how we can improve metacognition with students, and that was really helpful. I was super motivated when I left that workshop, and that's what drove the discussions I'm going to talk about today. So initially, when I started with the critical thinking, I took the class discussions and tried to turn them into critical thinking opportunities for the students. And as you can see, this was, the 2014-2015. We would focus on the different elements of critical thinking, and I would build on them each week and bring in another element. So it worked pretty well. The students became real familiar with the purpose, question, information, and so forth from the elements of thinking. And throughout that time, especially our English faculty started to incorporate all these in their classes too. So the students are sort of getting a little bit of a background in the critical thinking concepts. But I found in my particular courses, it was restricting discussions a little bit, and I couldn't always match the critical thinking with a specific learning outcome through a discussion. I needed to have a little bit more flexibility in the activities the students were doing to meet the student learning outcomes. So then last year with Dr. John Drager, he talked a lot about Kimberly Tanner's work. She wrote an article, I don't have it right in front of me, but it was on improving metacognition in students. She's a biologist and focused a lot on how to do this in biology classes.
Judy, was that research mostly for college students or for high school students, or what was that? Do you know the background in that at all?
For Tanner?
Yeah, or even for Drager's work.
He does a lot of workshops in, he does business and higher ed. Okay. And he works a lot with graduate students, and that came up when he was with us for the day. I'm in a community college, and most of our students are not college ready. something like 80% of them require remedial math, and many, many students need developmental English and reading skills when they get here. And so all of his presentation was based on talking about what the students read. And I even raised the point with him during the workshop, and I said, we have to back that up and motivate the students to read. Like, that's our fundamental problem, is they're not reading the material, they're not understanding what they're reading, and then it's difficult to move on from there. So in fact, we did kind of step the conversation back a little bit and try to think about how can we get the students to read. And that, for me, that was the underlying motivator to come up with something like this that would really go one step further in trying to encourage the students to read.
Okay.
So his workshop was based on this table from Kimberly Tanner, and these were questions that they recommend that we use with our students to help them with their metacognition. And so, and you can see some ties with the critical thinking, obviously. So that we talk about the questions, the strategies, the amount of time that they're spending, what motivates them, what's working, and how what they're doing aligns with the course objectives, their overall learning goals, and the future, because we really want them to develop good study habits, strong learning skills now, and then be able to transfer these skills as they move on, regardless of what they do next. So as I said, an issue that we had was that this whole strategy presupposed that the students were reading the material. And so our first challenge was to get them to read, and then get them to think about how they read. And so the solution for me that I'm trying is it's a weekly low stakes discussion. And so we base it on that table that we just saw with the metacognitive prompts and the assigned readings. And in these history courses that I'm doing right now, it's typically a textbook chapter a week. And so from that, I came up with discussions and just called it Metacognitive Cafe. So I wanted sort of a catchy title, but I'm also a big fan of making sure the students know what it is I'm trying to help them do. I know that a lot of times we say that things are infused, or that students, if we just have all these different experiences, they'll absorb all this, and I don't really buy into that. I think I need to tell the students straight out, like, you need metacognitive skills. This is what they are, and this is how we're going to do it. And I do the same thing with, like, the course student learning outcomes, the institutional learning outcomes. I don't think they just magically absorb them as they move through their college career. I think they need to know what it is the goal is, so that they can be more successful. So this is an example of what a week looks like with these discussions in them. So I just picked a random week 11. So what I try to do with the students is give them my little about thing I have every week. I send it out to them in an announcement that goes to their email. And it's also posted in the course. So the week 11 folder starts with this. And they can see exactly what they need to do. First and foremost, I always tell them to read. So read chapter 10, and then I always give them an approximation of how much time it takes. So this helps them with their time management skills. And then I always put the word required, because bafflingly, at the end of a semester, I'll get a student who say, well, I didn't know that was required. I didn't know I had to do that. And I said, well, so yes, it is. It's required. So so read the thing, look at the notes, and then the middle bullet there says complete inquisitive chapter 10. I use Norton published as the publisher, and these inquisitive quizzes are mastery quizzes that are excellent. The students sort of game the quiz. They wager points on an answer based on how confident they are in in how, and if they're correct or not. So the
Right.
students can wager so many points. They have to earn 1,500 points to complete, to master the quiz and get the 10 points in the grade book. So they start off really confused by this, but fortunately Norton has a good intro quiz for them to get used to how it works. And then by the end of the semester, they really like it. This is by far, when I do the evaluations and surveys at the end, the inquisitive is probably 80% of the students say that's their favorite part of the course. But I always tell them to plan 2 hours on that, because it really does take 2 hours until they either figure out you have to read the book first or, until they just get more in the habit of how the process works. Excuse me. So basically they read, they do their quiz, that's every chapter, and then the virtual poster is for a course student learning outcome. And then the final thing they do every week is participate in their Metacognitive Cafe. And then I try to tell them how many hours per week to spend on the course. So I try to put all this together so they know exactly what's expected of them, how long it should take, and why they're doing all this. So this is what it looks like in the course. Every week, this chunk is in here. The metacognition is thinking about learning. When you think about how you learn or think about thinking, you improve your thinking and learning skills. So I try to just keep that in there like a boilerplate every week so that so they can try to start to use this terminology in their talking, in their speaking too. And then each week, the basic question changes. So for this sample week, where they're talking about the topic of their research paper and how they're finding scholarly sources. I like this. I know it's not quite on the chart, but the online students spend so much time on their research papers. I have it broken down into 5 parts. And so they spend 9 weeks on it. And there's no opportunity to discuss that. And so I like to put in some kind of discussion just so they can share the cool things that they're learning and find out what other students are researching. I do put in the student lounge in every course, but they just don't talk about things like that. The student lounge, somebody might say, when is whatever due? Or, they just ask very vague questions, or not vague questions, but sort of terminal questions. And there's very little discussion. So I try to also give them a place to share what it is they're discovering and find out more about what other students are discovering. So in this example, the student, and this is another thing. So in these Metacognitive Cafe discussions, I rarely participate. Just every now and then I'll say something. But I do give them these 5 stars. This is in Blackboard. I give them the 5-star rating so that they know, first of all, they know I read it, and then they know that they're on the right track. I do the ratings with all discussion posts. Whether it's this cafe or if they're having a discussion about one of the course learning outcomes, just so that they know they're on track. Because particularly sometimes I'll have a discussion going on for a couple of weeks. I don't always want to interject something, because sometimes I think when the instructor gets in and starts to respond, it sort of ends the discussion right there. I want them to keep talking but know that they're on the right path, so I use the star rating. I really like that.
Are those star ratings viewable to everybody, or are they private?
Everyone can see that. Yep, they can all see that. You can't rate yourself, you can rate others. I find that the students don't rate each other. I'm the only one that ever uses the stars. I don't know if that's unique here to GCC or not, but they never do it. So I never tell them they can, but I think they're right there though. When you read the posts, I think anyone could select stars. And I always give them 5. I never say, well, that's 2 stars, because this doesn't tie to the grade book at all. That's just sort of an opinion.
Okay.
It's like, you're on the right track, keep going, keep going. But this student here, you know, she talks about her thesis and whatnot. And then she just makes this comment on finding helpful scholarly resources through the use of the library databases, which is fine. And then a couple of students responded to hers. You know, it's a very interesting topic. Then I have not yet used the library database, but that's a great idea. And then somebody else says, I'm using the database too. My favorite link is JSTOR. And of course, historians love JSTOR. And then the bottom student says, oh, I have to look at the databases. I totally forgot about them. And you think, you know, in all of the directions for your research paper, we link to the databases, but apparently it slipped his mind. But I like this kind of discussion because what one student is finding useful, they're able to share with the others. And maybe a light bulb is going off somewhere. It might have helped one of these other students out. Oh, so I went too fast on that one. But another example, and this is one that I do comment on when somebody shares a picture. But I really like this question. And just ask them about their workspace. What does it look like? Do you read in the same place you work on your assignments? And then I invite them to share photos. And some of these I think are really kind of personal. Like this student shared her workspace. She works in the library, so that's the little cubicle she likes to use. And the other ones are from their homes. And you can kind of imagine the student sitting here. And this student commented on how she likes to be by the window so she can work there. And this one I like, this is the student with their calendar on their ceiling and, and their workspace. So they're really sharing these personal things, and then a lot of their conversations get pretty personal too about how they're scheduling time in their lives, what else is going on in their lives while they're trying to do their coursework. So I really see a sense of community here that I don't always see in the more content-focused discussions. So this is the kind of thing I would wish was happening in the student lounge, but at least, you know, we can get conversations going that help the students relate to each other and help them share ideas better. But so here's a sample of what some of the actual questions are. You can see in the top one, that's in chapter 1 of it's the Ancient World course. So I say, what did you know about the agricultural revolution before reading this chapter? Well, anyone could answer that probably. And then, but when you just say, what was the most interesting thing you read about it? They have to at least open the book to respond to that part of the question. So I think carefully wording things like that, it comes across like you're assuming that they want to answer, especially in the beginning of the semester when they're the most optimistic about how they're going to do. And so they open the book and they look up something about the agricultural revolution so they can answer this question. Then the next week, I ask them if they prefer the textbook author's descriptions or the primary sources. So again, they have to look in the book to post any sort of a question of a response here. And then the third one, what questions occurred to you as you read this chapter? And then by week 4, you know, I'm just flat out saying, how long did it take you to read the chapter? And so if they don't read the chapter at all, you can really tell when they posted the answer or, you know, post their response if they've engaged with the chapter at all. And I do find, by and large, the students who are participating in the discussion board are reading the book, or at least reading enough to be able to answer these questions. Then I ask them to compare the textbook and quiz to the videos. I use John Green's crash course world history videos in the course, and I like those. They're all about 10 to 12 minutes long. They're pretty fast paced, but he covers a lot of content quickly and humorously, and has a lot of visuals. So then number 6, you can see the workspace question. The number 7, I talked to him about motivation. How do they plan? You know, do they reward themselves? And the 8th question there, why is it important to read the chapter before doing the assignments or taking the quiz? Sounds, you know, sounds really fundamental, but they do talk about that. And most often they'll say, I tried to take the quiz without reading the chapter, and, you know, and it took so much longer. And there's a lot of, it's sort of like it's almost an epiphany for the students. They say, well, I noticed when I read first, the quiz is easier. And you read that and think, well, no kidding. But for the students, it really is, it's something new. I think they just try to skate by and do the bare minimum and move on to the next course. But now they're realizing that if they slow down, engage with the materials, and think about what they're doing, the rest of the work follows a little bit easier and they learn more. So then by now we're, you know, 9 or 10 weeks into the course, and I try to get them to think about how they can use the skills we're using in this course in their other classes. And then talk about their research paper. And then just talk about how all of this supports the course student learning outcomes. A lot of why I do this is because I teach gen eds, right? So most of the students, over 90% of the students don't want to take these courses. They take them because they have to. And I try to help them realize or uncover why a general, liberal arts education helps them in their broader educational goals. And that's what question 11 sort of helps to move toward. So by now, I think, because we've been talking about other things, I try to bring it back to the textbook and say, okay, look at chapter 11. We've got Zheng He and Joan of Arc, you know, and then start to talk about the book again. Make sure they remembered they're supposed to be reading that. And then we move on to their other academic goals and sort of wrap up the course. And at number 14, where I say, what did you enjoy the most about this course? That's where a lot of the students go back to those mastery quizzes. They really do like those. Here's, this is a very common response, that I had attempted to do the work without reading the chapter, but I wasn't successful. I ended up having to go back to the book and reading to complete the assignment. And then typically they say that they wasted all that initial time, and in future weeks, everything they do is much more efficient if they start with engaging with the materials. Excuse me. So this is an example of another week. I try to lay out, every week I lay out exactly what they have to do, how long everything will take, and then you can see in the middle, it says plan to spend about 7 to 8 hours on coursework this week. And then, so back to this whole metacognition, critical thinking, I see it in the course as just a combination of all these things working together, the mastery quizzes, the critical thinking that I do talk about in other areas of the course, their peer review and feedback, how they're examining sources when they're doing their research, obviously the Metacognitive Cafe discussions, their time management, and then I'd give them additional resources like this tips for learning, and just try to talk about different strategies like the Pomodoros and interleaving, so that they can try out different things, or just have them exposed to different things that I think are easy to talk about in the classroom when you're face-to-face, but can be a little bit trickier when you're online and you're just presenting these materials and not having the off-the-cuff conversations. So as far as the students' responses to this at the end, so I had these cafe discussions last spring and last fall, and I'm doing them again this semester. We just started our semester yesterday. So, and then they do the institutional course evaluations, but I also survey them. I survey them pretty often in Blackboard with the survey tool. So I ask them if these discussions help them better understand how they learn or what works well for them. And I think it was pretty favorable. You can see the 52% agree, 19% strongly agreed, and then 19% were pretty ambivalent, and only 9.5% disagreed. So I'll take that. I think that's favorable. And some of their comments, so the Metacognitive Cafe was a great way to extract information and absorb the input of other students. It's fun to see the different output each person has, even though the material was all the same. And the middle one, I really like this one. The discussions sometimes did not mean much to the coursework, and they didn't, and that's okay. But it helped me learn how to learn the material better. So to me, that was the whole point. I think history as a gen ed, I love history. I'm a historian because I wanted to be. It's not for everybody. I get that. And if students can have a fundamental understanding of how things happen throughout the course of time that brought us to where we are today, that's fine. I don't care if they memorize names and dates because they can Google them. But if they learn how to learn, then I feel like I've done my job. And I like the bottom comment, I enjoy how course discussions allow you to branch off and have open dialogue. So I think the benefits of introducing this kind of low stakes conversation, it's almost like a back channel to the course. I really believe the students read more as a result of it. I feel like the students built more of a community, and it raised their awareness of learning. And I'm really hoping that they have developed some habits now that they'll carry into their other courses. So going forward from here, I plan to stick with this, but I think I'm going to revise some of the questions. And and so some months ago, I participated in a Learning How to Learn MOOC, and really got a lot out of that one. I want to try to incorporate more materials from that course into my courses in general. And so that's about all I have. I have the resources here. I don't know, they're not much use to you on a slide, but I can send them to John. Tanner's article and the sample questions from that grid, and the critical thinking sources, John Drager's blog, and the Learning How to Learn MOOC. So does anyone have any questions? Or?
I don't really have a question. I just have a comment. I think the students' feedback was really telling, because it shows the purpose and how important it is to help students stop and take a look or think about their learning, and the idea that what you're doing in this course isn't just about this course, but it's about your overall learning and, how to be a better student. I teach in the School of Ed, so it's also about how to be a better teacher. So I really love the ideas of pulling in stuff from the course reading, as well as other stuff about how do you study, or all of it. And I think the estimates of time,
Mm-hmm.
I would imagine that's really helpful to students, because I think students think, an hour is going to be plenty. That's all I need to do this course. And I do freshman advising, and I talk about how much time they have to spend on each course. So like a 3-credit course should be this many hours outside of class, and they're always, oh, no, I don't need to do that. In high school I was really good. I never had to do that. And I'm like, well, rethink that now that you're in college. And inevitably at midterm time, we revisit that topic and that discussion, because some students aren't always, in the beginning of the semester, they're not willing to take that, to make that time commitment. So I think that's really great that you do that.
Yeah, thank you. They really appreciate that. I do get a lot of favorable feedback on that, and I try to and I don't know. I mean, a lot of it is timelines that I do in this course, just to cover some of their course student learning outcomes. So they'll do like a timeline of different philosophies and religions throughout the ancient world. And I think I underestimated those because I did get a lot of pushback from that. They said, you said it would only take 2 hours and it took me 5 hours.
Oh.
So I try to learn as I go too, and I'll refine some of that. But then other things, you know, I always say, spend 2 hours on the quiz, 2 hours on the quiz, so that they know I'm trying to be consistent, and then they kind of get the hang of how long it takes them.
Right.
And a few students, there was one student, you know, she's a school bus driver, so she's commented that she gets up at 4:30 in the morning to do her homework, and then she has to drive the bus and drive students here and there and pick up her own kids, and then she's got like this little window between when she drops off her students and waits for her own kids to come home where she can hop in for a half hour and do something. And so when I have it broken down in times like that, she knows what she can accomplish and what she has to put off for later. And I think that does help them with their time management skills.
Yeah, I think that's great. Now, did you just guess those time limits or those time estimates, or did you get feedback from the students when you first did this the first semester, or?
It's a kind of a combination. They I do know I can look at the inquisitives to see how much time the students spend, and I do know that the students with the highest grades spend over an hour, so I put 2 hours on that every time. And for me, I'm a slow reader by nature, so I'm always kind of second guessing my estimates, because if I have a fast reader in the class, then they might say, you know, I didn't really need all that time to read. But so I try to give them I try to round up, I guess, when I do the time estimates, just to make sure they do have enough time to accomplish what they're trying to do.
Right. I think it's hard when you're familiar with the content and you've read the chapter before. If you're using like the same textbook or resource or whatever.
Right.
It's hard for me to estimate how long it's going to take for students to really read it and understand it. And Rebecca, didn't you have an article or something about estimating time or readability or something?
Yeah, there was an article, I think it was in the Chronicle. But one thing that I've discovered is, like, I'll time how long it takes me to read it, and then I multiply that by about 3.
Okay.
Oh, that
works pretty well for you? I mean, that seems to be in the ballpark of what students need.
Judy, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the questions that you were thinking of revising, like which things were really giving you a lot of like helpful information, maybe what kind of questions like were not in the cafe?
One in particular, let me see if I can go back. Just bear with me a second. There is one, the number 9, how does the reading and research in this course help you with other classes? A lot of the students misinterpreted that, and as the content, like, okay, so how does reading about Joan of Arc help you in your statistics class? You know, like they didn't interpret it the way that I meant it. What I meant was like the reading and research, that just planning the time to do it, doing it thoughtfully. And so I just need to reword that to make it clear that I don't mean so much the actual, you know, names and dates and events, but the skills that you're using, how will they help you in your other classes? Mm-hmm. That was the type of thing. Yeah, sometimes, I don't know, I know what I mean when I write a question, and sometimes I'm surprised at how it's interpreted by the students.
Yeah. And this is all done on Blackboard? You use Blackboard as your platform?
Yes, yep, it's all on Blackboard.
Okay. And how many people do you have in your class?
Each of these, these are all, materials here are all from this past fall, and I had 25 in one and 31 in the other. So roughly about 28 students in a class.
So does that take you a long time to work through all of the discussion? Because you read all the discussion posts.
I do. Yeah, I read them, and I go to the discussion board and read right through all the discussions like a student would. And that's when I give them their star ratings. So I read them all, and then I go to the grade book and grade what I've read. And that way, it seems to work. Sometimes, I'll admit, sometimes I'm looking for keywords to see what they're addressing, or just kind of checking, if they've omitted anything. But for these discussions, they're very easy to grade because I don't grade their content. I grade, as long as they're on the right track, I just grade that they did it. Because I have a rule, if it's opinion, I'm not going to say your opinion isn't worth as much as the next student's. So, but for their CSLO discussions, I have a pretty comprehensive rubric that even includes, if they've participated throughout the week or all on the same day, and how they've responded to other students, what sources they're citing, and all of that. So, and they know, I put the rubric in the syllabus, and then I have in my course material section, in my course menu, I have a link to the rubric so they can see them all. And I think if you read through the discussion board and then go into the grade book and use the rubric, it really doesn't take very long at all.
So the CSLO discussions or postings are separate from this Metacognitive Cafe?
Right. So that would be, and those, all of these Metacognitive Cafes, every week they're 5 points.
Right.
It's 3 points for what they post, and then a point each for responding to 2 other students. But the other ones, the core student learning outcome discussions, are 30 points. So they're more of a high stakes thing.
And those were the things like drawing a mind map or whatever you had over there.
Right, yeah.
Descriptions, right, okay.
Yes. And sometimes I try to mix up those so that they can do virtual presentations or posters. Sometimes they'll do PowerPoints, and often, sometimes it's just an essay or some type of written response. And the peer review essays are part of the core student learning outcome assessments too.
And in terms of the rubric, we have a very nice recording of a couple of past workshops that Judy had done with a detailed description of the rubrics. And I think we have a link to the rubrics in there as well.
Okay, great. Yeah,
this one thing with student discussions overall, I think this year I'm trying to change it up a little bit. I always did the, you post your thing and then respond to 2 other students. But I'm not finding as much conversation back and forth as I imagine, as I daydream will happen. So I'm going to have them only respond to 1 student, and then have that student respond back, and just sort of have 2 people going back and forth on a discussion, and see if that works out any better. So I'm not sure.
Yeah, I think when you have a bigger class too, it's harder to keep track. It's sometimes harder to keep track of if they comment on 2 discussions and if there's a discussion back. It's
right. Yeah. Yeah. I know. I kick around the idea of putting them in discussion groups, but I don't know. I'm just not comfortable with that. I think because I get such a wide range of students, age-wise, and just with their different academic backgrounds, I just don't feel comfortable putting them in groups like that.
I think that would be hard to do, especially online. It'd be one thing if you were doing face-to-face and you kind of got a sense of their, how they work together, or
right, the dynamics. Yeah,
it's a little bit different online, I think. Not better or worse, just different. So it's harder to put stuff.
Yeah, I agree.
I love this these questions too, or this whole idea of the metacognition, because I teach face-to-face classes, but mostly, but I think the idea of even starting off the class in a group, a small learning group, and asking these questions and thinking about this stuff can really be a good springboard for the class.
Yeah, I think it's really helpful. A couple, they post things like, "I'm so glad to see I'm not the only one who struggled with this," or I think you know, they get that sense of we're all in the same boat type of thing. I'm trying to flip through. I have some notes of their comments. It's hard to, this is a tough kind of presentation because it is all words, but I know that we don't want any more words on the PowerPoint than is necessary, but I think that you know, they're saying things like, the reading and research in this course helps me with other classes by making me better with time management. In the future, this will help me out a lot with managing the everyday changes and struggles in life. Another student said, the things I have been learning have helped me in my daily life. I am able to examine current events in the world with some perspective of the lessons of the past. Then, oh, well, here's one. Somebody said, I wouldn't, in response to how does the reading and research in this course help you with your other classes? A student said, the things I have been learning have, oh, excuse me. The student said, I wouldn't say the subject helped. I would say that researching and reading will help us throughout our everyday life. Reading is something we do every day, and researching is a great skill to know how to use it when in need. I have found that having more than one source for information for research can certainly lead to laying down a stronger foundation for the work you have at hand, regardless of the topic you are studying. So things like that, when I can see that, you know, they're going to be able to transfer some of this to their other courses, I think that's great. And I just hope they stay with it.
One of the things I really like about that is in the discussions you're having peers talk to each other about what's working. You know, there's a lot of research out there that when you tell someone they should do something like it, the Department of Energy, for example, noted that when they provide information to people about how to lower their costs or how we could reduce home heating costs significantly, it has virtually no impact. But when information is posted, they've done some experiments on this about how other people in your community have been able to successfully lower their heating bills. It has a dramatic effect on behavior. And that's the sort of thing I think that this sort of thing can do, that when students hear about what's working for other students and the amount of time they're spending or the effort they're putting, it creates much more of an incentive than if you told them what they should be doing.
Yeah, I agree. I think that that's true. I mean, those peer interactions I think are really invaluable.
Yeah, I think I do think they learn from each other, and when it's more like they're sort of like comrades or colleagues sharing ideas, and you really get the sense of that when you read through all the different discussion responses. Does anybody have any other questions?
Oh, this was great. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. I learned a lot.